everyone, my name is Jen and I'd like to welcome you back to my little corner of YouTube here. I still don't have a name for the channel itself, but this particular series is called the Scrappy Blanket Diaries and this is volume 2. If you joined me last week for last week's episode and you're coming back again, thank you for coming back. Or if this is your first time clicking through a video on my channel, welcome. I am glad you are here. Thank you to everyone who liked and subscribed and, did all the YouTube things with last week's episode. It was really encouraging and inspiring and definitely kept me motivated to want to sit down and record another update. I know last week I said I wasn't sure about the frequency of when I would post videos over here or be able to sit down and record videos, but between getting a lot done over the course of the last week, having a few thoughts that I wanted to share or follow up with last week's video and all of that encouragement, plus having a little bit of time in my workday that I can sit down and do all of this, the stars aligned and here we are with volume 2. If you'd like to connect between videos or off YouTube, you can find me on Instagram as ndgen04. And I'm also under the same username over on Ravelry as well. Although I will admit I do have project pages over in Ravelry. I am not as great about keeping those updated and I'm not spending as much time over there as I once did many, many years ago. But I'm still out there if you want to connect over there as well. You could also send me an email at commuternidder@gmail.com. I'll put all of that on the screen, of course, and in, all the things in the description box below. But again, thank you to everyone who has reached out since the last episode and sent your kind words of encouragement. I really do appreciate it. So before we dive into kind of my progress report around where I am with the 2 blankets for my kids, I did want to give a little bit of a follow-up and I had some questions about the patterns I'm using or the squares that I'm crocheting up. And I wanted to share that here. I know I answered some of those, whether they were private messages over on Instagram or some questions in the comments as well. I thought I would incorporate some of that because it might be a common question that others have as well as far as how I am working up these blankets. So as I shared in the last video, I have got a knitted blanket on the go and I've got 3 crochet blankets that are currently on the go. The knitted blanket does have a pattern that is the Jelly Roll Blanket pattern by Kay Jones of the Bakery Bears podcast and YouTube channel, which I did link in last week's video. And then the other 3 are just solid crochet granny squares that I am working up in various ways. So the first one that I showed you is just a solid crochet granny square. Then I'm doing a checkerboard pattern. I think that one I'm doing a 5 round granny square. The second one, which is the first one I started for one of my kids, is another checkerboard pattern, but smaller squares, but same concept where I'm doing a solid crochet granny square that I'm attaching together in a checkerboard pattern with a contrast yarn. And then the 3rd crochet blanket or the 4th Scrappy blanket overall is the one that I am working on for my other daughter, where I'm doing a 3 round crochet granny square and then a continuous join as you go through the round. And I had some questions about the square itself. So some folks had mentioned that, they had not seen a granny square like that before, where it was more solid and, it was a little bit different from what they are used to. So I thought I would bring a couple different granny squares here to show you kind of the difference. I'll link some resources below for solid granny squares, but if you search here on YouTube or if you just do a general search online, there are lots of resources and lots of tutorials. So this is not meant to be a tutorial per se, but really just kind of showing the differences. So in last week's video where I shared some of that Vlogmas footage and I showed that Mario granny square blanket, which really, to be fair, and I think the pattern itself is called a bedspread because it's pretty big. It's a pretty big blanket. I didn't look up the actual dimensions. I should have done that before, but if I remember, I'll put it on the screen. But it is a lot of squares that are crocheted up, and then I seamed these together. I did not join these as I go, and that was part of the thing when I was coming up with or trying to figure out what I wanted to do with these squares that I was crocheting up last year. I knew I wanted to do it in a way that I could join them as I went, and I didn't have to go back and do any sort of seaming whatsoever, because that was a big roadblock and a big hurdle for me. And it's why this particular blanket took me several years to make. But this particular granny square, and I don't know if it's considered a traditional granny square. I will admit I am not as well versed in kind of the history and the background of a lot of the more common crochet techniques or patterns or things like that. I really just muddle my way through when it comes to crochet, but I'm sure there's someone out there that might correct me in the comments, or, you know, have some more insight into what's a more traditional granny square versus what is, you know, all the things. But I feel like when you're in the world of crochet squares, the possibilities really are endless when it comes to, you know, how they're constructed and everything. But I think what I was getting from a lot of the comments or the messages that I was receiving is that a lot of folks were kind of more familiar with this type of granny square, where you are crocheting and doing your double crochets into the spaces between the clusters. And so for this one, right, you started with a circle, or I started with a circle. I did my 3 double crochets. I have my chain space here to do a corner, etc. So I get my 4 clusters here. And then in the next round, I am doing my double crochets in those chain spaces in between, and, you know, following that pattern around each of the subsequent rounds. And so what you end up with is this granny square that has much more open, you know, there are a lot more open spaces on this granny square compared with the one I am doing. And I'm going to use Zelda's blanket as an example, because there's more solid spaces and there's not that border around. But this one, where you just have the spaces here kind of creating this X where you make the corners. So I start in the same way, where I start with a circle. And for me, I do start with a chain 4. I slip into the first chain and make a circle that way. You can start a granny square with a magic ring or a magic circle. I just prefer to do mine with the chain instead of the magic circle there. And I know it does create a little bit more of a gap. When I go to weave in my end, I will pull that a little bit tighter. And I know, again, with the magic circle or magic ring, you can close that up pretty tightly, but it's just a personal preference of mine. The same thing, but you end up with your 3 or 4 clusters of 3 double crochets each. Let me actually use this one because it's more solid instead of the speckly one. So you could see you've got there, but on the next round, so when I get to I usually slip over into the corner, and I like to start my round in the corner. So I'll chain 3 and do a double crochet. I do my chain 2 for the corner and the double crochet, but then as I'm going along each side, I am crocheting into those 3 double crochets from the round before, if that makes sense. And then I do my corner, I crochet into the 3, do the corner, etc., etc. So each time I go around, I'm increasing, or I'm adding 4 double crochets to the row, plus, you know, because of the corner stitches. And I know that sounds confusing and it's not making sense. Again, I'll link a bunch of resources below, but you can also search for just solid granny squares. But I liked the look of this for this particular project, but I knew as I was making these squares, I wanted something a little more solid. And so I just keep repeating that around, right? I'm increasing in the corners basically, right? To add more width or length, right? Around each side. And then as I'm joining as you go. So for this particular blanket, when I do 3 rounds, and then when I'm on the 4th round, and I can show you this easier if I'm at the spot where I'm about to add another square, right? So for this section here, I would do square in this color to make the checkerboard. I'm going to do my 3 rounds, and when I get to the 4th round, I'm going to attach it. And as I do this side, I'm attaching it here, and as I'm doing this side, I'm attaching it here. And again, I'll link the videos that I did for those that joining technique, because it's a much clearer video. It's a tutorial you can fast forward and rewind. It's done in a more solid yarn, so you can really see, really see how you're attaching those squares. But I think a lot of the questions were really around the solid nature of this square that I'm using. And so, like I said, I just wanted something with a little more heft to it, that didn't have as much open space. You still have, like I said, you have the open spaces in the corners. And as I was looking for different links and resources and things, there are options out there where you get a completely solid granny square. And I didn't actually watch to see what those techniques were, but I might put a few of those down below as well, where you don't even get the gaps, that make this X across the square, but it is more of a completely solid look. So again, it's just a personal preference for me for these projects that I wanted something a little more solid in nature. And so I think at the end of the day, right, if we're going to be spending all of this time and energy to make a project, you want it to be, something you're going to enjoy. And I like I said, I love the finished look of it, when it's all crocheted up and attached together. All right, so before we get into the actual numbers and the updates of where I am with both of the blankets that I am focusing on over the course of the next couple weeks, I thought I'd also share with you some of the ways that I set myself up for success. As you all know, if you are working on a big project, whether it's a knitting or crochet project, or it's a project for work, or just some big daunting task that seems like it's going to take forever, or there's no way you could finish it in that particular time frame that you're trying to finish it in, it's always helpful to kind of break it up into smaller bits and pieces, smaller bites, but also to think about what are going to be the hurdles along the way. And I know for myself, if I reach a roadblock and a hurdle and I'm like, oh, that's it. Sometimes I'm just in a mood and I just, I'll get to it. And then days, weeks, months maybe pass and you've got this languishing project that has not made any significant progress along the way. And then when you finally do pick it back up and you're thinking, why did I put this down? Oh yeah, because I had to do that thing that really at the end of the day only took a few minutes to do, but it seemed like it was this hurdle that you had to overcome. And I know I'm making it sound much more dramatic than it really is. At the end of the day, it is just, I don't want to say just, but it is knitting and crochet. And for someone like myself, where this is completely a hobby, it's not the way I make a living, it's not my bread and butter, right? That's very different, right? Of course, than someone who has, a yarny business, and that is the way that they, make money or make a living and whatnot. So I come with that particular perspective. So for those who might not have joined last week or watched last week's episode, real quick, I am using the Down Cellar Studio Pigskin Party Make-Along that Boston Jen hosts over in the Down Cellar Studio podcast community that wraps up in February. February 10th is the last day to finish up any projects that you started within the course of the National Football season. You don't have to be a football fan. You don't have to watch football. You don't have to know anything about football, but it just happens to coincide and follow along in that season. And so Aurora's blanket, which is the one I am crocheting that has a border around it, I did start during the time frame of that make-along. And if I finish it by the end of the make-along, you get internet points. It's a whole thing. But for me, it really is a motivator to set a deadline and say, okay, I really want to get moving on this. And so as I shared last week, I've got a spreadsheet, which I'll get into all of the numbers and things. And so I know how many squares I have to crochet each week, which I break down into how many I have to do each day to kind of keep on pace to get me to the finish line for the make-along. And then I have Zelda's blanket, that checkerboard one that I'm wanting to work on concurrently, because I'm also using all of the same minis and leftovers and things like that. And of course, having two kids, I know that if I don't finish the second one very close to when I finished the first one, right, there could be, Mom, when are you going to finish my blanket? Mom, when are you going to finish my blanket? So again, trying to keep the pace there. So I know that in the back of my mind, okay, I've got to crochet 6 squares a day to keep on pace with this blanket, which means probably close to 6 squares a day for the other, et cetera, et cetera. But I also sat back and thought about what are the other hurdles? What are the other things I have to do to get these projects going? And so here it is over here. I'm surrounded by piles of blankets and squares and my notes and all the things. So as I showed last week, this is Aurora's blanket. So this is the one where I am doing the 3 round crochet granny squares, and then I am using a continuous join as you go method for each of the rows. And I'm doing, so for Aurora's blanket, it's 14 squares across, and she wants hers to be 21 squares long. She's the one who loves the number 7. And so I'm using 7 different yarns to join the squares. As you can see, I'm on the 7th one already. I had 4 rows done with last episode. I had the 5th yarn already wound, and I knew I had to wind yarns 6 and 7. So I had taken the morning off on Thursday. The kids were back in school. My husband was back in the office. I didn't have a full morning of meetings and everything. So I had decided earlier in the week that I was going to just take that morning to have just to breathe, right? After the hustle and bustle of the holiday break and getting the kids back to school and just having a little bit of time to myself to do whatever it was that I wanted. And even if it just meant sitting with my cup of tea, sorry for shaking the camera there, or sitting with my project, whatever it was. So part of that time I did spend kind of setting myself up for success when it comes to these projects. Let me put this down. Sorry for the shaking. We're good. And so I got out the ball winder and Swift, and I wound up the 2 yarns that I needed for rows 6 and 7, which I will then use again because I'm repeating that 3 different times. So I got that yarn wound. I got it weighed. I did take some footage of some of this stuff along the way, so I'm sure you're seeing that instead of seeing my face here. So I got those yarns wound. I got them weighed because I wanted to know how many grams I had to start with for each one. So even though the label says 115 grams, I might have 119 or 120 grams to start. Or some of the DK yarns have a put up of 100 grams, and that actually might have 105 or 106. When you're working on a project this big, or you're working on something where you're cutting it close, you don't have an extra skein or 2 kind of cushion, it's helpful to know if you have those extra 5 or 6 grams, because times 3 skeins or whatever it is, right? That adds up a bit along the way. And I'm using between 35 and 40-ish grams per row on those joining rows. So having between 105 and 120 grams will get me, the 3 full rows that I need. I do have extra skeins of each of those colors just in case, but it is good to know, and I want to kind of know where I start. And then I weigh the yarn again after I finish that joining row to know how much I used up. So I know, okay, am I going to have to wind up another skein of that color. The other thing that I did to set myself up for a little bit of success, and again, so I don't have to think too much as I'm working on the project, because again, I don't know about you, but if I have to sit and figure out, well, wait, hold on, which minis did I already use? Which ones did I use in this blanket? Especially if you're doing 2 projects at once like I am. And so what I did was I got out a couple different project bags and I started organizing the yarn. So this is actually all the yarns that I have to work up for Zelda's blanket that I've already worked up into Aurora's, and I need to add to Zelda's. Now, to be fair, Zelda's I had a bit of a head start since I started hers in March of last year. As of last week, I already had 90 some odd squares done. And this one also has her contrast yarn. And so what I'm doing is after I crochet a square for Aurora, if I'm not ready to crochet a square for Zelda, and I'll talk a little bit more about how I'm working Zelda's in a little bit, I'm putting it in this bag just so I know, okay, these are the yarns that I have not yet put in Zelda's blanket. Now we are going to have to repeat some colors because again, both blankets will be just under 300 squares altogether. Aurora's, will be 14 by 21, which is 294. Zelda's will be 13 by 23, which will be 299 squares. And so I will definitely need to repeat some colors, and in a 20-gram mini, I can get, so Aurora's takes about 4 grams, Zelda's takes about 7. So if the mini is a little bit generous and started with 22, I can get 2 squares for each kid out of each one. But for now, you know, I've had them each pick out some of their favorites, so I know, okay, if I can get a second square for this kid, you know, she'll be happy, et cetera, et cetera. But at least creating a system for myself that, okay, if I'm going to sit down and work on Zelda's blanket, I know this is her yarn. And similarly, I'm pulling the minis out of the box directly and starting those for Aurora's. And I should probably mention, if I'm showing a bag, this is from Stitched by Jessalou, who is a wonderful bag maker. I've been following her for years. I have so many of her bags, and she vends at both Rhinebeck and the Fiber Festival of New England, both of which I attend. I think I got this one at Rhinebeck this past fall. I know Zelda picked it out. That's how I know it's Zelda's blanket, because it's got all the little Disney princesses. I think it's the princess. Oh yeah, it's like a silhouette of the princess with her respective villain, right? So here's Aurora and Maleficent and the spinning wheel, the evil queen, and Snow White, etc. And so the girls always like to pick out a new project bag. They both dabble in knitting a little bit, but I will say I commandeered the bags, and I said, well, I need them for your blankets, so can I borrow them? Clearly I could use a bigger size. This is the tall wedge size that Jess makes. And so, like I said, getting these kind of just in a system, so it's less that I have to think about. And then even for Aurora's blanket, even though I'm starting with the minis for her blanket and then moving them to Zelda's blanket, even at the start of the day or maybe the end of the day before, just picking out the next minis that I'm going to work on, winding them up so they're ready to go. So again, trying to get rid of that little hurdle that might stand in the way. Okay, so after all that rambling about setting myself up for success, hopefully you found that insightful or helpful, or like, oh yeah, that makes sense, you know, to try to help with a bigger project. Where did I end up after this last week of setting myself up for success, but also making progress on these blankets? So last week, if you didn't watch last week's video, I'll tell you where I was last week. So on Aurora's blanket, which is the one here that I'm doing the borders on, I had 4 full rows completely attached, which is 56 squares, plus I had 5 squares kind of waiting in the wings, if you will, that weren't yet attached to the blanket. I ended the week with 98 squares attached and 98 squares done. So I don't have any kind of extra squares waiting to be attached to the blanket. And I'll put a little bit of an asterisk on that, in that I am still working my way through this border round for attaching the squares, but all of the squares are attached to the blanket. Again, I will link the technique that I'm using for the tight continuous join as you go for this blanket, which goes into much better detail, and it's a much clearer explanation than I'll probably give you here, but just a general idea. For the joining row, you're joining all of the one edge of the squares, right? So you see here where I've joined this edge, and you go all the way across. And actually I started here, because here's where my end is, and I worked my way this way. When you get to the end, you go up here, over here, down, and then here's where you do a thing to join in the corners here. And as I'm working my way up this square with the contrast yarn, I'm also connecting it to these double crochets, work across, work down, connect in the corners, and as I'm working up here, I'm connecting it here. So you can see this better over here. So here's where I ended. Here you can see I try to leave the live stitch big. I could put a stitch marker in there, right, to kind of hold it in place, but I'm going to start working my way up here, and then I'm going to connect as I go, right? So I double crochet into here, I connected here, et cetera, and then work my way around. But for all intents and purposes, this whole row is attached, and I'm calling it attached for my counting purposes. I should be able to get through the rest of this by the end of by the end of today anyway. The other thing I'm doing, and I don't know that if I mentioned this earlier, but I do have some clips of Aurora and I are doing this together and doing it myself. As I'm crocheting the squares, once I get to 14 squares done, I'm attaching them into the row, and I'm having Aurora help me with, just help me figure out the placement and everything. I'm not being super particular or precious about which yarns are going where. I mean, if there's a colorway that's kind of similar, I'm trying to separate it out just to create a little bit of balance. But at the end of the day, it is just going to be a beautiful scrappy blanket. So that's also helping me to keep a good pace. So I'm working through squares. I get to 14. I figure out how that row is going to look, and I start attaching them to the blanket. Because again, having the thought of attaching 294 squares all at once seems pretty daunting, but attaching 14, hey, that doesn't seem so bad, right? And it also gives me, it's a little bit, I mean, it's still all double crochets and things like that. So it's not like it's a huge shift in what I'm doing with my hands, but at the same time, it's still just something a little bit different. So overall, I started last week. I think I mentioned this. I don't know. I've been rambling too long this morning. I started last week with 61 squares done, 56 squares attached. So it was 4 complete rows. My average was about 38 and change squares per week to keep on pace to get this done in time for the end of the make along. And now I've got 7 full rows attached and 98 squares done. I don't have any other squares kind of waiting at this point. It's just the 98 that are attached. So I'm at about 39-ish squares per week because I got 37 done last week. But again, I took a lot of that time to do all that kind of pre-work or that other stuff that needed to be done. And it was time that I could have spent. I could have been crocheting squares. So I do feel confident that I can still keep that pace, right? Because I'm not having to do all of that other calculating and figuring out and winding yarn and all of that stuff. So that is helpful. So for Zelda's blanket, which is this checkerboard one, which I've showed you previously. Now, like I said, I'm trying to work on it concurrently, but as I showed you that big bag of yarn, I haven't been keeping nearly the pace that I was doing for Aurora's blanket. So Aurora's, what did I say? I crocheted 37 squares over the course of the past week. For Zelda's, I only did 9, but I am at an even 100. So percentage-wise, I'm actually about the same when it comes to their blankets. I'm about a third done for each of them. So Zelda's blanket is 13 squares across. She wants it to be 23 rows long, which comes out to 299 squares, and Aurora's comes out to 294 squares. So we're just under that 300 mark for both of them, and just around 100 squares. So yeah, we're just about a third of the way done for each of them. Now, when I recorded last week, I wasn't sure how big Zelda wanted hers to be, but as I showed you on the screen and as I just mentioned, she wants hers 23 rows long, which will make a pretty substantial size blanket. And who wouldn't just love all these beautiful colors to snuggle up in and whatnot. But I knew I was not going to have enough of this contrast yarn to do the 23 rows. And so I did figure out that I can get, keeping with the Taylor Swift 13, I can get 13 rows with what yarn that I have of this Lola Bean Yarn Company. I think it's called I'm a Little Lad Who Loves Berries and Cream. I have enough. I can do 13 rows with this as the contrast color. And I pulled out a couple other options for her that I'll do. And what I'll end up doing, and what's kind of nice, again, about the way I'm working up these blankets is I can go ahead. So this was the start of the blanket, right? This is what is the top row, if you will. But I can build this way and I can build that way. So what I'll end up doing is have this color be kind of in the middle, have 13 rows in the middle, and I'll do 5 rows this way and I'll do 5 rows that way to get her the 23, and that the other, 2 sections will have a different contrast color. Now I have enough of a particular colorway to do all 10, but I'm going to see how she likes it, and maybe we'll do a second option, right? I mean, there are no rules when it comes to Scrappy blankets. I think that's my the lesson I have to remember for myself, right? There are no rules when it comes to this. It's just all personal preference and well, I mean, there's some boundaries in there with how much yarn you have or what yarn you have to work with, but you know, we'll see how it goes for there. So we have a plan for hers as well. I have not wound that yarn yet because I still have quite a ways to go. So what am I? 2, 4, 6. I'm still on the 8th row here. I still have a ways to go before I'll even need to start thinking about that other contrast color. So, you know, I talked about on Aurora's blanket, setting myself up for success there. That's a roadblock. It's not imminent, that particular one, but I will wind that yarn when we get there. The other thing, and I know I mentioned that when I was all the ends, right, that I have to weave in. The good thing about, you know, kind of my job and the meetings that I have, if it's not a meeting that I am leading or actively participating in, I can very easily knit, crochet, you know, do something. It actually helps me to pay attention better than if I was just sitting there at my desk, usually multitasking in my inbox or messaging with coworkers. I mean, that's just kind of the reality of corporate life, if you will. But I have, especially in the middle of the week, though we had paused for the holidays, but they will be starting up again. This week, I have a number of very long meetings that I can very well sit through and just, you know, weave in the ends, right? Kind of go on autopilot and get the ends woven in. So I am not too concerned about the plethora of ends that are with this particular Scrappy blanket. As you can see with Zelda's, I had woven in some of the ends along the way. And even with Aurora's, I had woven some ends in. So it's just really the last week of work that I haven't, well, I shouldn't say that. I think there's more than that. But regardless, I do it in little bits and pieces and little chunks along the way. All right, so that is where we are with these 2 blanket projects. I feel like I'm in a good place. I'm glad I set myself up for some success doing some of that kind of other parts that have to get done to get these projects off, you know, I want to say off the needle. See, it's the knitter in me. I know these are big crochet projects, but I'm still a knitter at heart. So I wanted to say off the needles, but to get these projects done, I think I'm in a good place to keep this pace, to keep the momentum going, and to make all that progress. So thank you for coming along on this adventure with me on my little YouTube experiment here. For the likes, the subscribes, the comments, you know, all of the YouTube things. I greatly appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. So thank you very much for all of that. I will be back when I have some time and another update to share with you all. But in the meantime, you know, I hope your crafting is treating you well, and we will talk soon. Bye. Up that row for her. So what I'm going to end up doing